Welcome to The Creative Cure, the podcast that explores questions related to creativity and the mental health of creative artists. My name is Petra Borzinski, I'm your host, and I have a background in psychotherapy and the performing and literary arts. And today I'd like to talk about the impact of social media on creative artists' mental health. Because, let's face it, social media has become an integral part of our lives, and as creative artists, we use it for a multitude of things. Showcasing our work, connecting with our audience, finding inspiration as well. And in this week's episode, I'd like to explore the impact of social media on our mental health. And that could be in the positive and the negative sense, because there's really plenty of both. Now, generally speaking, the internet can expose us to new ideas and perspectives and lots of opportunities. It also provides us with feedback and encouragement, and it also helps us to reach a wider audience. The key really is to use social media in a balanced and mindful way, in a way that supports our mental health and creativity rather than harming them. Because if we're not careful, we can very quickly move down the slippery slope of comparison. All of a sudden, every artist seems to have more success, more talent, more recognition than us. And that makes us feel envious, insecure, and also lowers our self-confidence. What I'm sometimes acutely aware of myself is the pressure to constantly and consistently produce new content. I mean, you're listening to a podcast right now, and I'm doing this in my spare time. So that is, of course, a real issue for many of us, just like engaging with followers, keeping up with the latest trends. And if we're not careful, that can really result in burnout, also in anxiety, loss of motivation and feeling like, why am I doing this at all? It can also make us compromise our artistic integrity and chase after likes and views instead of following our passion and vision. And that's not even mentioning negative feedback that we might receive, or criticism, or, God forbid, trolling. All of that obviously hurts our confidence, and it is really a problem for a lot of people that the focus goes too much into that direction. What can also be a problem is information overload, that we're constantly distracted, and that we start to suffer from a fear of missing out. And needless to say, that's neither good for focus nor for productivity or creativity. Creative artists are often seen as people who have a lot of freedom in their day-to-day lives, but we also have to cope with many unique challenges that affect our mental health. One of the challenges creative artists face most, I would say from my point of view at least, is uncertainty. We frequently have to deal with unpredictable income, irregular work hours, lack of job security, and constant rejection. And all of that obviously creates stress and anxiety. And then there's also the not so small problem of having to meet deadlines while producing high quality, creative and unique work. And that easily leads to exhaustion and loss of motivation. Now, I'm not saying that this is specific to artists only, but it can be compounded due to the type of work that creative artists do. I personally love working alone, but I also know that many artists feel immensely isolated, and many creative artists often work without much social interaction or support. Of course, again, doesn't go for each and every single one of us. But for those of us to whom that applies, it leads to loneliness and potentially even feeling depressed and a general sense of disconnection. One of the biggest challenges we face is the relentless criticism of our work. Communication in social media, unfortunately, often ends up fairly dehumanizing, and many people forget that a real person with feelings is at the receiving end of our comments and our critique. And yes, attachment to our work makes us more vulnerable to negative feedback and judgment, or even trolling. But that doesn't mean that that type of behavior is okay, of course. And I'd also like to turn this around a tiny bit, and each time before we press post or enter, to really reflect on how am I communicating what I actually want to say, because I think we can all be guilty of maybe being harsher than we sometimes intend to be. And the written word doesn't lend itself very well to communicate emotion in a way that it would be communicated if the person was sitting right next to you. Social media absolutely divides people. Often the thinking surrounding it is very black and white. Either everything is good or everything is bad, when the truth, like so often, is probably found somewhere in the middle. Of course, a lot of research exists about the negative impacts of social media on our mental health, and that shouldn't be brushed aside. And if any of you are interested in some of this research, I wrote about the impact of especially visual social media a while back. And I will put that article in the show notes so you can read up on it if you want to. So let's look into some of the myths surrounding social media use that are applicable to almost everyone, but especially to creative artists. One of these myths is that social media is always good for inspiration and creativity. Of course, it can be a source of inspiration, feedback, and exposure, but it can also make us fall into the comparison trap that I already mentioned. That we feel pressure to conform to trends. It distracts us from our work and exposes us to not so nice experiences of people maybe trolling us a tiny bit. And of course, all of that affects our mood and our motivation and our confidence and maybe even our original work. But the myth on the other side of the same coin is that social media is always bad for mental health. Social media can definitely provide us with a sense of connection, community, and support. And it's needless to say that all of these improve well-being and happiness. It can actually help us to cope with stress, anxiety, and depression because it provides us with resources, information, and advice. We just need to be mindful to always double check and not trust everything blindly. Social media can also absolutely be addictive and isolating for some people. But as I said, it's also a source of connection and support for others. And at this stage, social media addiction is still not a recognized mental disorder, although I personally don't think it has to be to understand how absolutely devastating it can be for people. But we see it rather as a behavioral pattern that may indicate underlying psychological issues like low confidence, depression, or anxiety. So going on social media too much and focusing on it too much is usually rather a symptom than it is the actual problem itself, although it can turn into a problem and it has addictive potential. Isolation isn't always a direct consequence of social media use as such, but as I said, it's rather a result of how people use it. Because if you start to use it as an escapism from problems or to avoid real-life interactions, that will definitely worsen your mental health instead of improving it. But we can also use social media to enhance social relationships and to express ourselves or even to seek help. So in a nutshell, the way we use social media always reflects our needs, motivations, and also our deeper problems. Another myth I'd like to address at this point is that there is somehow a right way of doing social media. Because let's face it, different artists have different goals. They have different preferences, different styles, and also massively different audiences. And some artists may use social media to showcase their work. Others may use it to collaborate or exchange ideas. Some artists prefer to use one platform, depending on the features offered and what their target audience is. But some artists also have a large and loyal fan base already that they take to social media, while others may struggle to build that fan base and to reach or engage their audience on that same platform. But if they maybe look around a tiny bit, another platform might work actually quite well. So it's a bit of a process to find out what works for you, and only you can do that, no one else. But you can definitely connect with other artists who cover a similar niche and exchange ideas with them. And I'd really encourage you to do that and not to be afraid of competition or talking to people who do the same thing as you do, because really there is enough space for everyone. And then a very, very important myth to go into is that social media is a reliable source of information and advice on mental health. Now, that's a personal bugbear of mine, and the irony that you are listening to this via a podcast, or that you're maybe also reading my articles and my newsletters, is not lost on me. Social media obviously can be a very useful source of information and advice, but it also spreads a lot of misinformation, and no one really regulates or monitors the quality or accuracy of the content that is shared or posted. And censorship is another topic that I don't even want to go into here, or how social media providers actually deal with this whole issue, because we'd still be sitting here tomorrow if I did. But suffice it to say, anyone can post anything on social media, regardless of their credentials, regardless of their expertise, regardless of their intentions. So you're bound to find a lot of information that is inaccurate and outdated or biased, or maybe even dangerous, depending on what you're looking for. From misleading and false claims about mental health treatments, to products, to services, to promotion of harmful practices. And I'd always say, especially if someone, advertises products, supplements, and that type of stuff, I'd always be very wary, because at that point you can already start to assume that the information is becoming biased. So please always try to make the effort to verify sources and check the facts before trusting them blindly. Also goes for this one. And I'm aware that can be challenging, because who should you ask? My advice would be to look for peer-reviewed research on the topic that you're looking into, but most of all, to consciously seek out information that contradicts your own beliefs and biases. That's a tricky thing to do, but it's also a very important thing to do, because that information might still not change your mind, but it will give you a more rounded, in-depth view and makes you ask more questions instead of just believing the first convenient answer. At this stage, I'd like to lead you into the exploration, like in every episode, because social media can be super helpful in connecting if you use it in a balanced and mindful way. What you need will obviously be individual, but here come a few ideas to get the thought process going for you. First of all, set limits and have boundaries. As we already said, social media can be addictive and distracting, so it's important to be mindful about the amount of time and energy we spend on it. We can use apps and tools that track our social media use. We can set timers or reminders to take breaks. We can also turn off notifications, mute or unfollow accounts that make us feel bad, and avoid checking social media before bed or first thing in the morning. So really find what works for you. For creative artists, it's especially important to think about when and how we share our work and how we respond to feedback. Choose the best time and platform that suits your goals and audience. So don't care so much about if everyone says, everyone should be on Instagram or everyone should be on this or on that. That really depends on what you do and also how you want to engage with your audience. So don't just randomly share in the hopes of getting followers and likes. Focus your energy on constructive feedback and positive interactions instead of negative or toxic comments. I always call self-compassion the little powerful thing, because it's not so little, but it's very powerful. Social media makes us compare ourselves to others. Unfortunately, it does, or maybe sometimes also fortunately, depends on you. But in many of us, it brings on envy and insecurity and maybe even low self-esteem. So it's really important to learn to practice self-compassion, and how exactly we practice compassion and gratitude without it turning into some sort of toxic positivity is very individual, because it's as important to acknowledge that sometimes we simply have these feelings of envy and insecurity, and that's totally okay. You could maybe try to write down what you're thankful for, or you could focus on appreciating what others have to offer and let them know, because sharing your gratitude also feeds back to you. It's really a win-win for everyone involved. Speak to yourself as you would speak to a friend. It's such an old adage, but it really holds true. That includes self-compassion for your work, like celebrating achievements, acknowledging progress, but also being kinder to yourself when you make mistakes and learning to appreciate those mistakes as opportunities to grow. Let's talk about support and connection very briefly. Because social media can create a false sense of connection and community while actually reducing real-life social interactions and support. I already went into that a tiny bit earlier. So stay in touch with the people who care about you and who understand your challenges. These people can be friends, family, teachers, mentors, but you might also find them in online groups and communities that share your interests and values. So it's not to say it's not good to have online groups, just don't focus all your energy on it. That would be something that always needs a tiny bit of looking into. For creatives, it's especially important to connect with other artists who can offer us inspiration, feedback, collaboration, maybe even friendship. And it's needless to say that if we feel we can't cope, or if we are overwhelmed or depressed, be that because of our social media use or other things that are happening in our lives, there's absolutely no shame in seeking professional help. And as usual, I'll finish this week's episode with a few questions for exploration. Feel free to share your ideas in our subscriber chat. I'll put the details of that into the show notes for you in case you want to join us, because that's also a chance to connect with like-minded people and talk to all of us. So my first question for you would be, how do I feel before, during, and after using social media? How much time and energy do I spend on social media every day? Why do I use social media? What are my goals and expectations? And do I feel the need to be successful or validated or liked when I use social media? What are my current strategies to cope with negative feedback, criticism, or trolling? How do I deal with comparison, envy, insecurity after I've used social media? How do I currently balance my social media use with real-life social interactions and support? How do I currently protect privacy and boundaries online? How do I maintain my artistic integrity when I use social media? Do I feel authentic? And how do I currently use social media to enhance my creativity and inspiration? Does it work, or could I do something differently? And that's it for this week. Over at my other podcast, which is called Shadow Truths, we look into issue number 3, which is called Dream a Little Dream, of Neil Gaiman's The Sandman next week. That's a mental health and well-being exploration via story. So if that's something that you find interesting, join us there. You might find a couple of ideas over there as well. And in a fortnight, I'll be back over here with my thoughts about coping with rejection, which is obviously a very hot topic for creative artists. And up until then, keep on finding the creative cure.